Charlotte, North Carolina, a city where crime has quietly crept in neighborhoods once considered safe. And on one August afternoon, a story unfolded that still sends shivers through every parent, every neighbor, every ordinary American who's paying attention. Her name was Iryna Zaretska, just 23 years old, a Ukrainian refugee who had fled the horrors of war only to encounter something just as brutal here in America. She thought she'd found refuge, a chance at peace. Instead, she met a killer. The man was DeCarlos Brown Jr., a career criminal with more than a dozen arrests, a history of violence, and a mind twisted by untreated paranoid schizophrenia. He believed Iryna could read his thoughts. He was convinced the government had chipped him. He heard voices, voices that told him to kill. On that day, he followed her. He watched her. And in a flash of unimaginable violence, he stabbed her to death, again and again, while she begged for her life. Surveillance cameras captured the horror. A young woman who had survived Russian missiles, now butchered on an American sidewalk because our system refuses to lock away dangerous men like him. But here's the question. Why was Brown even free to begin with? He had an armed robbery conviction. He once assaulted his own sister by biting her. He had a rap sheet longer than most people's resumes. And yet, thanks to cashless bail, thanks to Democrat-driven reforms, this man walked free. Free to kill. The family knew he was sick. They tried to have him committed. But because of convoluted guardianship laws, because of bureaucratic red tape, they couldn't. The system tied their hands, and now their daughter is gone. This wasn't just random tragedy. This was preventable. It was policy failure. It was ideological blindness that cost an innocent refugee her life. And when the story broke, America watched in horror. But how did leaders respond? That's where this case becomes even more revealing. About justice, about politics, and about who really stands with victims. The political firestorm ignited almost immediately, but the contrast in responses could not have been sharper. On one side was Donald J. Trump. Within hours, he posted on Truth Social, calling Brown an animal, a man who should have never been on the streets. He demanded a swift trial and the death penalty. No hesitation, no sugarcoating, no political spin, just blunt truth and tough justice. For families watching, it was a moment of clarity. Here was a leader willing to say what millions were already thinking. Republicans in Congress and at the state level echoed Trump's demand. They went further, calling for the judge who released Brown on cashless bail to be removed from the bench. A preventable murder, one GOP lawmaker thundered. This blood is on the hands of weak-on-crime Democrats. And they weren't exaggerating. Look at Brown's record. Multiple arrests, a prison term for armed robbery, and violent outbursts documented again and again. Yet North Carolina's liberal bail reforms meant he walked right back onto the street. He didn't even have to post $1. Now contrast that with Democrat leadership. Mayor Viles, facing re-election, issued a brief, detached statement that sounded more like bureaucratic paperwork than grief or outrage. She talked about healing as a community. Healing? A young refugee was stabbed to death in broad daylight, and the mayor's words were hollow, cold, almost robotic. And when Republican leaders demanded accountability, what did mainstream outlets do? They ran headlines like "Republicans Pounce." The story wasn't the dead woman, wasn't the broken system, wasn't the monster who should have been locked up. It was how Republicans supposedly seized on the tragedy. This is how the media covers crime in Democrat cities. Blame politics, not policy. But real families are left devastated. Iryna's father couldn't even attend her funeral because he's still in Ukraine, fighting for survival in a war zone. Her brother now speaks for the family, insisting her death was completely preventable. And he's right. The tragedy isn't just one family's nightmare, it's America's wake-up call. And it's exposing every failure Democrats refuse to admit. Let's look closer at the killer, DeCarlos Brown Jr., because the truth about him reveals exactly how broken our system has become. This was not a man who slipped through the cracks once. This was a man who lived inside the cracks. Over a dozen arrests, time in prison for armed robbery, domestic incidents, including the time he bit his own sister during a violent assault. He was a danger to everyone around him. Yet somehow, every time, the revolving door of justice spun him back out into society. And the reason? Liberal policies that value ideology over safety, cashless bail, reformed prosecutors who think releasing criminals is equity, judges who treat violent repeat offenders like misunderstood souls instead of ticking time bombs. But Brown wasn't just violent, he was sick. His mind was consumed with delusions. He believed the government had implanted a chip in him. He thought people like Iryna were reading his thoughts. He said voices told him to kill. His family begged for help, tried to have him committed, but ran into a legal maze of guardianship laws that made it nearly impossible. The system's red tape left them powerless. And here's the heart-stopping detail. All the warning signs were there. The arrests, the prison record, the assaults, the paranoid delusions. This wasn't a tragedy no one could have foreseen. It was a tragedy everyone could see coming. When surveillance footage emerged showing Iryna's final terrified moments, America recoiled. A young refugee who had already survived Putin's missiles in Ukraine, only to be slaughtered on an American street by a man who should have been locked away. The image of her running, begging, fighting for life, it wasn't just horrific. It was symbolic of what happens when justice is replaced by compassionate policies that let predators roam free. So we ask, who's responsible? The man who wielded the knife? Yes. But also the politicians, the judges, and the activists who built the system that unleashed him. And now one question is echoing louder than ever. Will there finally be accountability? Accountability. It's the word on every American's mind after watching yet another innocent life stolen by a man who should never have been free. And it's exactly what Republicans are demanding. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, now a national voice for law and order, stood before cameras and declared that Brown must face the maximum penalty under the law. No excuses, no delays. Her message was clear. This isn't just about one case. It's about restoring a justice system that's been gutted by liberal experiments. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has stepped in with federal charges. Why? Because under state law, weak penalties could let Brown slip through the cracks again. But with federal charges, prosecutors now have the option of seeking the death penalty, a punishment Trump himself has repeatedly demanded for killers like Brown. And let's be honest, that contrast matters. Trump calls him an animal. Bondi promises to pursue the harshest punishment possible. GOP lawmakers push for the removal of the judge who granted bail. Republicans act like leaders who actually care about victims. Now compare that to Democrats. Mayor Viles mumbled about community healing, as if she were writing a Hallmark card. Progressive activists warned against stigmatizing mental illness, as though the real issue here wasn't a brutal stabbing, but hurt feelings. And the media? They obsessed over how Republicans were using the tragedy for political gain, completely ignoring that a 23-year-old refugee had been butchered in the streets of their city. It raises the question, why does the left always seem more concerned with criminals than with victims? Why is their first instinct to protect the system that failed, instead of tearing it down and rebuilding it stronger? The American people see the difference. They see Trump demanding swift justice. They see Bondi standing up for Iryna's family. They see GOP lawmakers holding judges accountable. And they see Democrats offering platitudes while quietly hoping the story disappears. But this story isn't disappearing. It's growing. And it's forcing the nation to confront a painful truth. When justice breaks down, no one is safe. As the days passed, more disturbing details surfaced, painting an even darker picture of failure. Brown's record wasn't just a handful of petty offenses, it was a catalog of violence. At least a dozen arrests, a stint in prison for armed robbery, violent outbursts against his own family. One report detailed how he bit his sister during a fight, drawing blood. These weren't red flags, they were sirens. And yet, despite this history, a liberal judge cut him loose under cashless bail. Ask yourself, who benefits from this policy? Not the public. Not families who just want safe neighborhoods. The only ones who benefit are predators like Brown. Cashless bail isn't compassion, it's negligence dressed up as progress. And here's the cruelest part. Iryna's family had seen his instability firsthand. They tried to get him committed for treatment, but they were blocked by a maze of guardianship laws so complicated and so slanted against families that they couldn't act. Bureaucracy tied their hands. And when the system fails, the consequences land on innocent victims. Her brother spoke out after the murder, his voice heavy with grief. This was preventable. He's right. If Brown had been kept behind bars after his last violent offense, Iryna would be alive. If the mental health system had worked, she'd still be here. If Democrats hadn't forced cashless bail onto communities, she'd still be walking the streets of Charlotte. And yet, the mainstream media barely touched these facts. Instead, they sanitized the story, treating it like just another crime in a big city. But this wasn't just another crime. This was the murder of a refugee who fled war only to find death in the land of the free. And while conservative voices shouted for justice, liberals shrugged. When Republicans demanded answers, the media rolled out their favorite headline: Republicans pounce. They always frame outrage at injustice as a political stunt. But what about the outrage of a grieving family? What about the outrage of citizens who simply want to live without fear? This isn't politics. This is survival. And it's time America admits that. The silence from the left has been deafening, and when they do speak, it's worse than silence. It's dismissive. Mayor Vi Lyles, a Democrat fighting for re-election, had the chance to stand with Iryna's family, to demand real justice, to call out the failures that allowed this tragedy. Instead, she delivered a bland statement about healing as a community. Healing? While a young woman's blood was still on the streets? Families don't want empty words. They want safety. They want accountability. And what about the national press? Instead of shining light on the dangerous policies that freed Brown, outlets ran headlines accusing Republicans of politicizing tragedy. They treated outrage as opportunism. They mocked Trump's demand for the death penalty as harsh. They downplayed the fact that Brown's freedom was the direct result of Democrat bail reform. Some even tried to bury the story. Believe it or not, Wikipedia editors were caught suppressing updates about Iryna's murder, watering down details about Brown's criminal history and the role of cashless bail. Think about that. The world's largest online encyclopedia scrubbing a story because it clashed with the left's narrative. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down. On Truth Social, he called Brown an animal who should face the ultimate penalty. And while critics clutched their pearls, millions of ordinary Americans nodded in agreement. Because for them, this isn't abstract policy. It's the safety of their daughters, their sisters, their neighbors. The contrast is blinding. Republicans push for stronger laws, tougher judges, and real justice. Democrats offer euphemisms, cover-ups, and excuses. Which side do you think the grieving family stands with? And here's the brutal irony. Iryna's father couldn't even attend her funeral. He's still trapped in Ukraine, surrounded by war. He sent his daughter to America believing she'd be safer. But the policies of American Democrats left her vulnerable to a different kind of violence. A father's worst nightmare. A daughter gone. A system that failed. And leaders who refused to admit it. By now, the story had gripped the nation. But the deeper it went, the more it revealed about America's broken priorities. Iryna wasn't just another statistic. She was a refugee from Ukraine, only 23 years old, who had fled bombs and bloodshed to find safety in America. She survived Putin's missiles, she survived a war zone, and yet she was cut down in a Democrat-run city because leaders here refused to deal with violent criminals. The tragedy shook her family to its core. Her brother spoke with a fury only grief can sharpen. This didn't have to happen. He knew the truth. Everyone knew the truth. If the system had worked, if bail reform hadn't turned into a revolving door, his sister would still be alive. But the failures didn't stop at bail. They extended to mental health. Brown's family had tried to have him committed. They begged for help. But guardianship laws written by liberal legislators tied their hands. The system essentially told them, unless he wants help, you can't force it. And so a paranoid schizophrenic with violent delusions walked free until he found Iryna. And when she died, the coverage itself became a scandal. Mainstream outlets buried the story. They treated it as just another crime report, while dedicating endless airtime to far less consequential issues. Conservative outlets exposed the reality. The killer was a repeat offender, released because of soft-on-crime policies. The victim was a refugee, abandoned by the very system that claimed to protect the vulnerable. But try finding that narrative in the New York Times or CNN. You won't. Instead, they attacked Republicans for being too harsh, too political, as if demanding justice for a murdered refugee was somehow a partisan stunt. But ordinary Americans weren't fooled. They saw the footage. They read the police reports. They knew this wasn't about politics. It was about life and death. And as anger boiled, pressure mounted. Federal prosecutors were now preparing the case, and for the first time, the death penalty was on the table. The courtroom battle is already shaping up to be historic. Federal prosecutors, backed by the Department of Justice, announced charges that opened the door to the death penalty. This wasn't just a legal move. It was a statement that the federal government would step in where weak state laws had failed. For Iryna's family, it was a glimmer of hope. Her brother said plainly, if they had kept him locked up, she'd be alive. He's right, and now the nation waits to see if justice will finally be delivered. But outside the courtroom, the political stakes are growing hotter. Republican lawmakers are demanding the removal of the judge who allowed Brown out on cashless bail. They argue that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a dereliction of duty, a dangerous ideology that prioritizes criminals over victims. And then came Trump's latest words. On Truth Social, he unleashed a post that instantly went viral. This animal murdered an innocent young woman. He must face the death penalty. Quickly. No more delays. No more excuses. Critics called it cruel. Supporters called it common sense. But either way, it was leadership. Strong, unapologetic leadership that millions of Americans crave. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi pledged to work alongside federal prosecutors, ensuring Brown receives the harshest punishment possible. She reminded the country that every delay, every loophole, every failed policy puts more lives at risk. And she's right. But what about Democrats? Mayor Vi Lyles quietly continued her re-election campaign, dodging questions about the case. The national media downplayed the story, shifting focus back to Republican overreaction. It was a textbook case of narrative control. Minimize the crime, demonize the outrage. Yet the outrage isn't going away. Not from Iryna's grieving family. Not from her father, stuck in Ukraine, who couldn't even say goodbye. Not from Americans who see in her story the collapse of justice in their own communities. This case is no longer just about one murder. It's about whether America has the courage to confront a failed ideology before more lives are lost. The backlash is spreading, and it's hitting Democrats where it hurts most, at the ballot box. In Charlotte, Mayor Vi Lyles faces mounting fury. Voters see her weak response, her refusal to confront the truth about crime, and they're angry. She talks about community healing, but parents in those same communities are demanding something else: safety. They don't want empty words. They want leaders who will put dangerous criminals behind bars and keep them there. And nationally, Republicans are seizing the moment, not as the media sneers, but as a movement to restore justice. GOP lawmakers are drafting proposals to roll back cashless bail. They're pushing for tougher sentencing laws. They're even looking at ways to reform guardianship so families can intervene when a loved one's mental illness turns dangerous. Meanwhile, Democrats are retreating into the same tired excuses. It's just one case, they say. Or, we can't stigmatize mental health. But no one is stigmatizing treatment. The stigma here is that Democrats would rather risk innocent lives than admit their policies have failed. And Americans are noticing. Polls show voters trust Republicans more on crime, and it's not hard to see why. While Democrats wring their hands, Trump speaks with clarity. This man is an animal. He deserves the death penalty. While Democrats hide behind committees and commissions, Republicans call for real accountability, up to and including removing the judge who let Brown out on the street. Even the family's outrage has become a rallying cry. Iryna's brother has said again and again, this was preventable. And he's right. It didn't take a genius to see this coming. It just took a justice system with the backbone to act. But under liberal rule, backbone is the one thing the system doesn't have. This isn't just Charlotte's crisis. It's America's crisis. And every city watching knows, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And so the story of Iryna Zaretska is no longer just a local tragedy. It has become a national reckoning. A 23-year-old refugee who escaped bombs in Ukraine, slaughtered on the streets of Charlotte. A career criminal, paranoid and violent, set free by policies that put ideology before common sense. A family shattered, a father unable to bury his daughter because he remains trapped in a war zone. And a nation forced to ask, how many more? Republicans have made their answer clear. Trump calls Brown an animal and demands the death penalty. fast, without delay. Pam Bondi vows to pursue the harshest possible punishment. GOP lawmakers push to remove the judge who gave Brown freedom. These are leaders who speak with the urgency this crisis demands. Democrats, on the other hand, stumble and stall. Mayor Vilas offers platitudes about healing. National media brands outrage as Republicans pouncing. Wikipedia editors even try to scrub the story from view. It's not just weakness, it's denial. Denial that their own policies are costing innocent lives. But the people aren't fooled. They see the difference. They hear Iryna's brother saying this was preventable. They know her death didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because soft-on-crime policies let it happen. And now, the anger is boiling over. Because in the end, this case isn't about politics. It's about whether Americans have the courage to face the truth. Will we keep allowing violent offenders to walk free in the name of equity? Or will we return to the principle that justice means protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty? The answer will shape the future of this country. For Iryna, it's too late. But for the next daughter, the next sister, the next refugee seeking safety, the fight for justice is only beginning. And America is watching closely.